Polk's America, a podcast produced by the President James K Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. I'm your host, Thomas Samuel. Who is James K. Polk? In 1844, the Whig Party, led by the great compromiser Henry Clay, used this dismissive question to diminish the reputation and accomplishments of the dark horse Democratic candidate. How could the unknown Polk expect to defeat the great Clay? For many of us, our knowledge of James Polk's history begins and ends with his presidency. In reality, James Polk's reputation as a dark horse is somewhat overblown. Polk was a 7-term U.S. congressman who served twice as Speaker of the House, and in 1839 he was elected as the 9th governor of Tennessee. Now, in addition to contextualizing life in the United States during Polk's America, our series aims to answer Henry Clay's question, who is James K. Polk? On this episode of Polk's America, Dr. Barry Gidcomb of Columbia State Community College explores Polk's gubernatorial career and how the ever-ambitious Polk aimed to use his station as a springboard to higher office.
In 1838, Polk was coming to the end of his 7th term in the House of Representatives and his 2nd term as Speaker of the House. He was a powerful man in Washington, but there were troubles on the horizon. Unintended consequences of President Andrew Jackson's war on the Second Bank of the United States, the Panic of 1837, had rendered Polk's position as Speaker tenuous. Back at home in Tennessee, the Whig opposition had been in power for almost 4 years. Democratic defeats in 1835, 36, and 37 had demoralized the Democratic Party in Tennessee. And during that time, Speaker of the House, James K. Polk, was really about the brightest light that the Democratic Party in Tennessee had. And so it's not surprising that as the governor's race approaches in 1839, Andrew Jackson and Tennessee Democrats believe that a Polk campaign for governor would revitalize the party, win back the governorship, bring Democrats back into power in the General Assembly, riding Polk's coattails, and they prevailed upon him to come home and run.
As often was the case, Old Hickory had his finger on the pulse of his protege's career. Andrew Jackson's fiscal policies had caused turmoil on his home turf in Tennessee. President Jackson had depended on Polk as Speaker to further his agenda, and he would call on him again to salvage the state for the Dems.
Did Polk really want to be governor of Tennessee? It doesn't appear that he did. His sights were set on higher national office. The run for governor was a means to an end. He could get out of Washington and avoid a possible loss of power if he were to lose his speakership. At the same time, if he can pull off a victory here in Tennessee, this would prove to the Democrats nationally that he was the man to place on Martin Van Buren's ticket as his running mate in 1840. And possibly paved the way for his own ascension to the presidency in the future.
Dr. Gidcomb went on to describe a Democratic event in Murfreesboro, Tennessee in the August of 1838, in which James Polk addressed a crowd of 2,000 party loyalists. As his speech drew to a close, former Tennessee governor and Jackson comrade-in-arms William Carroll arrives to cheer Polk on.
They weren't ready to go yet. It was time for the toast. And one Democratic Party member gets up to make a toast in which he endorses William Carroll for another run as governor. Carroll, right on time, stood up, thanked his fellow Democrats. He announced that he was honored, but due to poor health arising from exposure in the late war being the War of 1812, but due to his poor health arising from exposure in the late war, he would not be able to be a candidate. And immediately, someone got up with another toast and nominated James K. Polk. And Polk stood and at least pretended to be surprised and shocked by this. But Polk will agree. He says he will do it for the party. And from this point, Polk launches a campaign like the state had never seen before. Most historians will tell you that James K. Polk was far from brilliant. He was lacking in charisma or even any kind of personal magnetism. It's like I have a twin. But Polk drives himself mercilessly. The incumbent Newton Cannon would find out that it was impossible to outwork James K. Polk. Polk is going to crisscross the state back and forth, devoting most of his time to East and West Tennessee because he was already very well known here in Middle Tennessee. Cannon would go out and join him from time to time for a joint canvass, but Cannon just couldn't keep up with him. So invariably, Cannon would wind up back in Nashville claiming that he needed to conduct state business. Sarah, meanwhile, remained here in Columbia playing the role of campaign manager, handling correspondence, arranging Polk's schedule, and worrying incessantly about her husband overtaxing his health.
Let's revisit the question, who is James K. Polk? He's ambitious, hardworking, a party stalwart and right hand to Old Hickory. But one cannot wholly answer the question without considering Sarah Childress Polk. Throughout James's career, Sarah was soldier and confidant, an advisor and organizer. Her expertise was one of James Polk's greatest assets.
Polk's grand strategy was to condemn national Whig policies like the Bank of the United States, the protective tariff, internal improvements at federal expense. And he would condemn Whigs in Tennessee for aligning themselves with those Hartford Convention Whigs in the North. Polk now seeks to make the 1839 gubernatorial campaign primarily about who the candidates support for the presidency in 1840. And he is certain that most Tennesseans will reject Henry Clay in Henry Clay's nationalistic brand of Whiggism or Whiggery or Whigness or something. I'm not sure. So Polk sticks to familiar themes in his campaign. The virtues of Old Hickory, the corrupt bargain between Clay and John Quincy Adams in 1824, the desertion of the Tennessee Whigs of the old Jeffersonian principles.
Polk ran a national campaign on the state level to galvanize Democratic voters against the incumbent Whig Newton Cannon. This strategy seemed to resonate. Voters turned out in droves.
Now, the outcome of this election, a stunning 89% of the eligible voters in Tennessee turned out to cast their ballots. In this election, Polk wins 54,102 to 51,396 out of 105,000 votes cast. Polk wins by less than 3,000 votes. The Democrats won majorities in both houses of the General Assembly. They also increased their membership in the U.S. House of Representatives by 3, elected 3 new Democrats. It was an incredible reversal of fortune for the Whigs. Both parties were in agreement publicly that this Democratic victory was due entirely to Polk's Herculean efforts on the campaign trail. Privately, Whigs in Tennessee and across the nation feared that the specter of Henry Clay had been too much for Cannon to overcome in Tennessee. Meanwhile, a very excited Andrew Jackson wrote James K. Polk a letter of congratulations, concluding with great satisfaction. Jackson wrote, "It will be at least a century before Tennessee will permit herself to be again duped into her late false position by such hypocrites and apostates as Bell, White, and Company. I think I may with safety say, all is well." Jackson was wrong.
So, who is James K. Polk? Well, he was the governor of Tennessee, and Tennessee Democrats were high on their new fortunes. But the tide would soon turn. Polk had roused voters by raising the specter of a Henry Clay presidency and sticking to national issues. Little did he know, national issues would affect his own ability to govern and his ambitions for a spot on the coming Van Buren ticket in 1840.
Tennessee's politics very closely mirrored the increasingly bitter partisan squabbles on the national scene, which will make things difficult for Polk. Tennessee, like the rest of the nation, continued to suffer from the effects of the Panic of 1837. And Polk's administration will be somewhat hampered from the very beginning by his own ambition to win a spot on Martin Van Buren's ticket the following year. Polk was determined to get the vice presidential nomination. Early in Polk's term as governor, 2 new counties were created in Tennessee. One of those counties is Polk County, named after Governor James K. Polk. What was the other county? Who knows? Van Buren. Van Buren County, named after Martin Van Buren. How about that? Polk's not going to accomplish a lot as governor. What could he have accomplished? Given the state's finances in the Panic of 1837, not much. One fact that Polk's term as governor confirms: it is really hard, it's really tricky to perform as governor of your state and leader of your party at the state level if your immediate goal is national office. Martin Van Buren's vice president was Richard Mentor Johnson, a former Kentucky congressman whose claim to fame was that he had personally killed the Shawnee chief Tecumseh during the War of 1812, though actual evidence to substantiate that is lacking. But at least that's what people believe. Old Dick, as he was called, a Westerner, helped balance the ticket for Martin Van Buren in 1836, and General Jackson approved of him being Van Buren's running mate. Martin Van Buren didn't like it too much, but he acquiesced. It made for kind of an interesting campaign slogan: "Rumpsy-dumpsy, rumpsy-dumpsy, Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh." They don't write them like that anymore. But midway through Martin Van Buren's term, Old Dick was on thin ice with many Democrats. He had been billed during the campaign as this war hero who had beaten his sword into plowshares and resumed his life as a virtuous farmer. However, reliable reports coming in from Kentucky from those in Washington who had visited Johnson when he was back home seemed to confirm that he wasn't actually a virtuous farmer, but instead he was a very satisfied tavern keeper living happily with his black mistress, and worst of all, he might even be an abolitionist.
Polk saw his opportunity. His old friend, mentor, and recently appointed Senator Felix Grundy began working to help Polk navigate a crowded field and secure the nomination.
There were a lot of claimants for the job. No shortage of Democrats out there that would have liked to have this spot. And James K. Polk, of course, is one of them. And Polk's unexpected redemption of Tennessee from the Whigs in 1839 kind of put him in the forefront.
Dr. Gidcomb pointed out that James Polk's success in Tennessee also revealed to the Whigs that Henry Clay may not be their best chance at the White House in 1840. Instead, they nominated the aged war hero William Henry Harrison. This presented a problem for the Democrats. All of a sudden, dumping old Dick off the ticket didn't seem like such a good idea. The Dems divided. Some favored a convention to nominate a vice presidential candidate to replace the controversial Richard Johnson. Others favored avoiding the conflict by allowing the vice president to be selected after the election by the Senate. The scheme was to run different vice presidential candidates on the ticket in different states depending on which candidate would help Van Buren the most. Felix Grundy began working behind the scenes to see Polk installed after a Van Buren victory.
Polk doesn't want it this way, though. Polk wants to be nominated at the convention, and he is bugging Grundy to no end about all of this. And Grundy finally gets so frustrated, he puts his foot down and he writes Polk. He said, "To all I have heard on the subject, I have one answer to make. You cannot be nominated by that convention. That, I suppose, is sufficient." Didn't want to hear anything else. Well, Polk winds up writing a letter to Grundy, and it's a letter that was intended and for publication. It was published in the Washington Globe, the official Democratic paper in the Capitol. And in this letter, Polk said that under no circumstances would he consent to be run by a minority against the majority of my own party merely for the purpose of strengthening the ticket in a few states. He just wasn't going to do it. And he wasn't going to accept the vice presidency from the U.S. Senate under those circumstances. He just refused to do it. Grundy was beside himself. He couldn't believe it. He'd been working so hard for Polk. Felix Grundy actually died in December of 1840, not long after the election. He dies in Nashville. And though I think the record will show that he died of natural causes, I think that at least partially, he was aggravated to death by James K. Polk. I really think he was.
It is telling that a presentation and podcast on the governorship of James K. Polk has more to say about Washington intrigue than Tennessee politics. But this gets to the heart of our question. Who is Polk? The Whigs in 1840 know. He is a man more interested in his next step than his current stride. And as the 1840 campaign began, Polk saw that his recent gains in Tennessee, the gains that thrust him into the Democratic Party spotlight, were being threatened by a new kind of Whig campaign. The Whigs ran the aristocratic Harrison as if he was an everyman farmer plucked from the field, and it was working.
Polk may well have recognized this coming disaster quicker than other Democrats in Tennessee. He desperately set out to rouse the Democrats in his home state. He went out touring the state again, campaigning for Martin Van Buren, to the extent that the Whig press will castigate Polk for neglecting his duties as governor, declaring $2,000 a year salary as governor, not as an elector. The people will elect their own president. They're telling Polk to go back to Nashville. The outcome, Governor Polk could not stem the tide. Harrison not only wins the election nationwide, he wins in Tennessee. He carries Tennessee by a vote of 60,000 to 48,000. Very embarrassing for Polk. And now Polk has to gear up for a re-election campaign of his own. And in Tennessee, the Whigs decide to run against James K. Polk, a young Whig named James C. Jones. Lean Jimmy Jones is 6'2" and weighs 125 pounds. He has this hilarious crooked face. He has this comedic delivery. He is beloved for his ability to make people laugh. He is the perfect candidate because the Whigs want to run a campaign in Tennessee like they had just run with Harrison nationwide. One of Polk's friends wrote warning him, "They will attempt to run Jones as the log cabin boy taken from the plow, when in reality he's never plowed a day in his life." For his part, Polk could not believe that this charade would work again in Tennessee. Polk had such confidence in the people, in the voters out there. He just couldn't believe that this would actually work. But when he and Lean Jimmy began their joint canvass across the state, Polk must have known he was in trouble. Polk's efforts to discuss the issues were constantly blunted by Jones' political foolery. One of Polk's supporters wrote about a debate the day before. He wrote, "Mr. Polk made an ass of himself talking sense to a lot of damned fools." What was the outcome? In the end, Polk was defeated in his bid for re-election. It was close. Out of more than 100,000 votes, Jones' margin was only about 3,000. Now, the big question is, where does Polk go from here?
Polk campaigned across the state of Tennessee 3 times between 1839 and 1841. Once to victory as governor, once to combat the log cabin and hard cider campaign in 1840, and once again in the unsuccessful bid for re-election against James Jones. Polk would go on to challenge Lean Jimmy one more time, and he would lose again. But Polk's ambitions were always in Washington, and in just a few short years, he would have his way. So who was James K. Polk as governor? He was a party warrior, a loyalist, and he fought hard for the Democrats. And Old Hickory didn't forget.
Jackson wrote, "Governor Polk deserves the thanks of the democracy of the whole Union for what he was doing there in Tennessee." He said, "He fought the battle well, and he fought it alone."
This has been Polk's America, a podcast produced by the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, Tennessee. For more information, visit www.jameskpolk.com. Thanks for listening.